Still Loading Podcast is brought to you by the wonderful people on Patreon. Amazing people like Pib Extra, Matt aka Stormageddon, Kevin from the Bit by Bit Foundation, Ryan K, Melissa S, Stephen P, Gilmer, and Mr. Biscuits have all been wonderful enough to support the show over there. So if you would also like to get your name read at the beginning of an episode, along with a bunch of other goodies, go over to patreon.com/stillloadingpod and check out everything it has to offer. On this episode of Still Loading, Deconstructing the Nintendo Bump. The second one. On this episode of Still Loading, fuck Nintendo.
I mean, you could use that whenever.
Which do I want? Neutral? Do I want chaos? We'll find out which. We'll find out what I'm feeling when we get to the edit. But all right, here we go. Hello, everyone, and welcome to this new episode of the Still Loading Podcast. I'm your host, Josh Koval, and today's episode is a little bit different from a standard episode. Normally, I do, individual game deep dives, or I do interviews with people in the industry, or I do, the Final Fantasy draft, every once a year type of thing. But it's usually one of the either interviews or individual game stuff. But this one is a little bit more of a roundtable discussion, or maybe a triangle table, because there's three of us on this episode here. But we're going to be discussing, or we're going to be deconstructing the Nintendo Bump. And what is that? For those who don't know, we'll get into that in just a moment. But joining me today to talk about this, to help me deconstruct this Nintendo Bump, first time guest on the show from the YouTube channel, skewed. skewed, how are you doing today?
Hi, pleasure to be here.
I'm so happy to have you on the show, man. I've been looking forward to this. I thought this would be a really fun topic, and I know I was telling you off mic, like you bring up this stuff a lot on social media to some interesting responses from very reasonable people.
Yes, very reasonable.
So we're going to have a hopefully somewhat reasonable discussion. We'll see where it goes, obviously, but I'm looking forward to this. I'm looking forward to hearing everyone's thoughts on this. And our other guest joining us, rounding out this triangle that I referenced before, returning. It's been a minute since he's been on the show on the show proper, I should say. He was on the Wet Day special on my Patreon. Yeah. For those who want to check that out, it's all about the wettest games that we know, and you let your imagination run with whatever that sentence means to you.
You sure did.
That episode better have included Senra and Kagura Peach Blast, is all I'm saying.
It might next time.
Yeah, I mean, Wet Day is an annual event. If anyone's actually curious, we did that episode. It's free on the Patreon. You don't actually have to pay for it. And if you're curious about what the fuck Wet Day actually is, just look up Comedy Bang Bang. That's all I'm going to say. I don't feel it's way too much to explain over here, but. I guess you already heard his voice. Chris from the Retro Hangover podcast is here. Chris, how are you doing today?
I am doing great. Thank you for having me on for this. It should be an interesting discussion. I want to see where it goes.
I'm so happy to have you on. When I was thinking about this topic, the first person that came to mind was you, just because I know you like to have these conversations, and the second person was obviously skewed, because skewed has these conversations a lot online, once again, with very reasonable people who really like to see things from outside of an American viewpoint.
Yeah, and calling them conversations is definitely putting it very in very mild terms, I guess.
Yep. Oh my gosh, I'm looking forward to this. So let's dive right in, right? Let's talk about this. For for those who don't know, the Nintendo bump, we're here to deconstruct it. What does that mean? What are we talking about when we talk about the Nintendo bump? And no, Nintendo isn't pregnant. But I would like to hear. I'm going to say because I've never really seen people say it flat out. So I'm just going to say what I've always considered the Nintendo bump to be. And if you guys agree or disagree or want to correct me, feel free. Part of this is also just to like make sure I'm on the same page as everybody else too, because maybe I'm a little off. But the Nintendo bump is where Nintendo kind of gets a favorable treatment, but with contemporary game scores as well as a view in video game history. A lot of people kind of put Nintendo in a higher echelon than other elements of game history. Sometimes justified, sometimes not. But the point is that sometimes it gets put into a higher echelon or it's given more importance than maybe it necessarily deserves. Not because whether the game or the moment was bad or in any sense, but like there might have been another game or another company that did something beforehand, but Nintendo kind of seems to get that the benefit of the doubt with it type of thing. And then in terms of a contemporary, happening right now, their games just on average feel like they review higher than most other games. So that's my impression of the Nintendo bump. I guess to start off, Stika, I'm going to throw it over to you. Do you agree with me on that? Is that your interpretation of the Nintendo bump?
I'll admit I'm not too familiar with the reviews that modern Nintendo games get anymore. I kind of don't watch or read modern reviews to be honest. I just like watch YouTube videos or hear opinions from people I trust, and I just like buy a game. And it also doesn't help that I rarely play games that are made by Nintendo. Like I have a Nintendo Switch with nearly 200 games, but out of those 200, maybe 4 are by Nintendo themselves. So I've played very little Nintendo. But when it comes to video game history, yes, I at least on that end, I have experience, and yeah, I completely agree. While Nintendo is a major player in gaming as a whole, and it was a highly influential player in many ways, it's gotten to the point where it's a little exaggerated at times, and it kind of it takes away not just from other companies which also did important things, but it outright deletes that history. It ends up erasing some of our video game history because it attributes things to Nintendo that a lot of times shouldn't be attributed to Nintendo, or that Nintendo did, but as a result of something else.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. No, I guess as a little to allude to my opinion in a little bit later on, because one of the questions I have later on is like how do we view it? Is it positive or negative or a neutral thing? But we'll get to that in just a moment. I'm kind of with you on that, Stika. Chris, I want to throw it over to you though. What are your thoughts on the Nintendo bump? Am I off? Do you have any differing opinions on like what the Nintendo bump is?
So I just want to start out with a slight background about where I first heard the term Nintendo bump. And it was from old friends of the show, Region Free Gamers, and it kind of connects into some projects. So hopefully I'm not shilling here too much, but the first time I heard it was on The King of Games 1998, which I was not a part of. And where the Nintendo bump would come up was with Zelda, the Ocarina of Time, and how that game was received. And I never seriously thought about it in terms of how Nintendo was viewed, where Nintendo's position was in terms of video game history and everything like that. And, when I actually started kind of looking into it and how Nintendo games had been perhaps more revered than some other games, and how Nintendo games perhaps got a little bit of undue credit that could be attributed to other games, much like Stika had said, it started to kind of come into focus a little bit more what that Nintendo bump meant. Now, I think like when we get into this, there's obviously, as you already alluded to, a contemporary view, and then a kind of retrospective view that in a sense now is a bit more retrospective, because I think that really came out in the 2010s about where that sort of source of retrospectiveness came from. But Stika, the kind of door that broke a lot of this open in terms of the modern conversation was when st1ka posted, why does everyone talk about Banjo-Kazooie all the time and no one talks about Croc, but Croc sold just as many titles?
I
And I
remember
think
that one.
yeah, and that's a great post to kind of illustrate what we're talking about in terms of the Nintendo bump. Now, we can talk about whether or not that's justified. I'm sure that will come up, but I do think that's something that needs to be considered within the annals of video game history, how we're discussing it now, and has the historical discussions, particularly out of the Western video game discourse, really given Nintendo a perception of being bigger and grander and more beloved than perhaps it possibly should have been.
Mm-hmm. And I think that's where a lot of our conversation is going to be focused on. And I just also want to say off the top, I can't speak for st1ka or Chris, but at least for myself, I don't hate Nintendo. This isn't meant to be an episode to bash on Nintendo or what they. I mean, you could bash on their business practices in the 80s and 90s. That's a actually that does touch into some of this. I would argue, not argue. I would almost definitively say that it has a big factor as to why Nintendo is so prevalent. But this isn't necessarily to bash on Nintendo. It's more just to kind of talk about, like I said, it's a roundtable discussion with the three of us here, just trying to like figure out not just our feelings, but like maybe just kind of posit like where all this comes from and where it not really necessarily where it's going, because who knows how people are going to view Nintendo as time goes on. But like at least for this is like for people in our spaces who are fans of video games and video game history, the Nintendo bump is a very real thing. And I agree with you, what you said earlier, st1ka, where it can have a negative effect where it accidentally or purposely, depending on the person, negates large swaths of video game history because it's for one reason or another, and we'll get into more of that. I guess to move on to the next thing is like, where does it come from / how did it come to be? Like, how did we get to where we are now, where Nintendo is this dominant force in like the zeitgeist in terms of, you know, video game history, and obviously in terms of dominant in terms of the modern video game culture, you know, like the current gen systems and that kind of stuff. That's a little bit more harder to like break down because, you know, that really depends on how Sony's doing and how Microsoft is doing, and neither are doing phenomenal. But that's a little bit harder. So I think, I don't know, unless you guys want to talk about contemporary stuff, I figured we would focus more on how did, like, from a game history aspect, how did we get to where we are now in terms of the Nintendo bump? I have my theories, but I want to throw it over to one of you first. Chris, we'll start off with you. How do you think we got here? And then obviously st1ka and I can chime in with our thoughts as we go along.
Well, first of all, I think a lot of gaming retrospective media today definitely stems from America. I think when you had the YouTube boom back in 2008, especially around retro games, 2008, 2009, up through 2012 and beyond, you had a lot of creators that were about our age. You know, they were born in the 80s, maybe late 80s, early 90s. And if you were American during that time, the key gaming demographic, the key game company that was aiming towards the demographic that would have been around that age during that time frame were people like us. There's a lot of kids games. I think this is why you also saw a lot of love for like Crash Bandicoot and Spyro and games like that, because that was really aimed at that demographic. Additionally, you consider that this is an American or North American base that's creating this content that's getting out there and is being consumed by a new audience and a new generation, so to speak. And you look at Sega with the Master System, which was just a complete flop in the United States. And even though the Sega Genesis was a massive success, and I would argue, at least contemporaneously, there was a little bit of a Sega bump, especially if you look at Sonic the Hedgehog scores and first-party Sega games. You could argue that. But I think because of Sega's marketing campaign and what they aimed for, along with Sony's for the first couple of years of the PlayStation, you're getting the demographic that was aimed towards. They kind of, I don't want to say they grew out of video games, but it felt like they grew out of video games more than the people that were slightly younger than them did. Because if you remember, Sega was targeting an older audience. So if you go back and look in reviews from the time period, I would say it was harder to necessarily argue that there was a flat out, simple Nintendo bump. And I would say like that, I think it was just more of what is popular. And that kind of got a little bit of a bump. And Nintendo was always popular. Like I said, Sega had a bit of a bump. I would argue that Square had a bit of a bump when it came to its games. And this would go for franchises. I think like once Tony Hawk took off, the Tony Hawk games got a bit of a bump. Or you look at the Metal Gear Solid series, got a bit of a bump, and all these things. And you could argue it was legitimate or not, whatever the case might be. But if it was a big game, it would get more of that bump. But Nintendo was always the most revered, and I think that's a lot of reasons. And even if you go to Japan, like where a lot of these games are being made, Sega was just not doing anything. So it's not like there's going to be a big counter Japanese point that's going to come out, even though they did have like the PC 98 and PC 88 that largely got forgotten by Western audiences just because, we didn't have those, or I won't say forgotten, ignored. And I this is where I think Steve can talk more to this. I don't feel like the console scene in Europe was necessarily a huge deal up until maybe the Super Nintendo Sega generation, specifically the PlayStation was the one that definitely, I feel from an outsider, really got Europe more into the console preference, because prior to that there was a bunch of PCs and microcomputers that just swept over that continent, and that was the dominant form of media. But then when you're coming back to a younger generation, especially I think when I saw from European creators, they're more PlayStation oriented, but that was also a key demographic. The ones that were making content also would have been around for, Banjo-Kazooie or Ocarina of Time, Super Mario 64. So I think that's how we kind of got to a point modernly where Nintendo just kind of hogs the conversation and hogs the discussion in terms of relevancy over the past 30 years.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And st1ka, what are your thoughts? Because one of the, I didn't just bring you on just because of the posts that you make that get everyone all riled up. I brought you on because you aren't based out of the U.S. and I, on a personal level, I do feel a lot of game history retrospectives and conversations are based around U.S. history, the U.S. perspective, excuse me, and that's not accurate because there's a lot more to game history than just what we saw here in North America. So, what are your thoughts on how we got here with the Nintendo bump?
Honestly, I generally agree with Chris's views. I think that the major culprit here was, like Chris mentioned, all the media and video game retrospectives that were made in the US. I think that the explosion of YouTube and YouTubers created such an impact of content, of a new type of content that previously we just didn't have, which was basically someone talking to the camera, giving out their reviews or their views or their experiences, that sort of thing, which it's just something that before YouTube just did not exist at all. Mm-hmm. But the problem is that, it's not a problem, but it was very US focused. And as a result, what a lot of us outside the US ended up getting was the US experience, the US view. Mm-hmm. And, as an outsider, I thought it was cool. It was something that I didn't know. I honestly had no idea Nintendo was so big in the United States before YouTube. Like when I grew up, I remember Sega being the big one in Europe, or at least in my country. Nintendo was big with the Game Boy, but never really achieved any major height until much later with Nintendo Wii. So I had a completely different view of Nintendo.
The Wii even, it really didn't hit huge strides until the Wii for you guys.
I mean, if you look at the Nintendo 64, 2/3 of its sales are from the US and Canada. So not even the Nintendo 64 did all that well outside of the US and Canada. So yeah, like if you're from a country where the Super Nintendo didn't do well or the NES didn't exist, or came late, Nintendo was a big player, but so was Sega, or so was the Amiga computers. Like you wouldn't necessarily place one over the other, to be honest. So that's already a major difference. But but going back to the point I was trying to make, yeah, like we got all this content, and what happened is, as information began to spread and copycats began to form outside of the US, I noticed two things began to happen. The first is that a lot of younger viewers assumed that the history they were being told on YouTube applied to every country. So like I've heard this complaint very often from other Europeans and Brazilians and Latin Americans, that a lot of people think that the video game crash happened in their country as well, even though technically it only happened in the US and Canada, or that the console wars was pretty much the same all over the world, including their country, even though we know that's not the case. Like older Brazilians know that the Master System also outsold the NES, the Mega Drive outsold the Super Nintendo in their country. So it already started like creating this very skewed version of their own country's history. And it's made even worse by a lot of YouTubers that I've seen in several languages, which are also not familiar with their own country's history, and they just kind of repeat the same talking points as American YouTubers. So they'll talk about the console crash, they'll talk about the Sega Genesis and Mega Drive and Super Nintendo console war, and they'll only basically talk about the US war, even though they don't directly say the United States, but it's mostly implied. So it's just snowballed into a wave of I would honestly call it misinformation, even though it wasn't intentional, but it snowballed into this very skewed history. And I think the other thing is that history is usually written by the winners. And as we know, Nintendo won the war against Sega. Currently, Nintendo is at the top again with the Nintendo Switch. And I've seen it affect consoles that I honestly would not expect. Like on Twitter, I've seen very young people like Generation Z being genuinely surprised that the GameCube was a commercial failure, for example.
Yeah.
Even though, like, if you grew up during that generation, you know it was a commercial failure because at least in my country, you didn't know anyone with a GameCube. In my entire life, I have met a single person who owned the GameCube. That's how rare it was here.
Wow.
I know it was a little bit more common in the US, but it was not a commercially successful system. Let's be honest here; it sold very poorly. It's just been a snowball effect on top of a snowball effect until it became this idea that Nintendo basically invented everything. Like I've seen people state Nintendo invented 3D gaming. It saved all of video games. Just absolutely ludicrous remarks. And
that's wild.
When you try to fight against it or try to explain it, they don't listen, or people will actively become aggressive. So it's become something of a problem.
It's so strange. Sorry, you were going to say something, Chris.
No, just to give some examples of some things I've heard, anecdotally from friends and stuff like this to kind of back up skewed. And you've probably heard this as well, Josh. So I'm going to have two. The first example is something we've probably both heard. In the King of Games, I want to say 96. There was, and this isn't a Nintendo example, but it does go to the YouTube point. There is a battle. It was the Suikoden episode with Suikoden and I can't remember the game it lost against, but and that advanced. But one of the points at the end, it may have been. It doesn't matter.
I'll try to look up the game while you're talking.
But like one of the points was think about all the YouTube videos where people have said how much they love Suikoden nowadays, and doesn't that make it an important game? Now, I'm not trying to say that Suikoden is not a great game. I love Suikoden. I think it's fantastic. But to kind of suggest that Suikoden was a big deal back
Tekken
then,
2. Suikoden versus Tekken 2.
Yes, and it's obvious which game of the two was bigger back then and which game of the two was considered better back then. And absolutely. I would make an argument that fighting games got a little bit of a bump back then too. Like if you look at the reviews of Battle Arena Toshinden. Like genres had their own bumps at that time, which nowadays, like a lot of those genres, like no one talks about those fighting games nowadays, even though they were wildly popular back then. But people still talk about the Nintendo games. But that was one of the points of contention was think about all the YouTube videos that came out. Doesn't it make that important? Now, more than Nintendo point, I want to bring up Earthbound. No one cared about Earthbound.
Absolutely.
No one cared about it. And I would even go so far, now this is my strict objectivity, like is Earthbound better than Chrono Trigger, Final Fantasy VI, Lunar Eternal Blue, Lunar 1, Phantasy Star 4, and there's a bunch of other RPGs I could probably get to before I got to Earthbound. Not to say it's a bad game. I do like the game. But do I put it up there? I personally don't. But now there's this impression that it's one of the greatest Super Nintendo RPGs of all time, and it's up there on the same level of Final Fantasy VI. And you believe, if you believe that, that's fine. But I think, generally speaking, no one considered that at all until the YouTube generation came out. And some people like, well, what about Smash Brothers? No, Smash Brothers did nothing for Earthbound. It's this, like, it became this kind of YouTube praise and almost revisionism that propped it up. And now Earthbound is considered a top tier game and an important game, even though at the time it was released, like no one cared about it whatsoever.
Mm-hmm. No, I think you both are like hitting the nail on the head with it. How much of our comment, and this, it even goes outside of Nintendo, where it's just now there are games that are considered, like you mentioned, Chris, with Suikoden, how it's like, wasn't this so monumentally important? I'm like, maybe for the developers, but for the public at the time, no. Like it didn't. Like, because it's one of those things, you never really know what developers are going to be influenced by what type of thing, but in terms of the public feedback for it, same with Earthbound, like you mentioned, it just did not. It was not popular when it first came out. And for my own kind of take on this, I actually think the Nintendo bump and how we got to where we are now stems all the way back from the North American game crash in '83, because you have. Part of it is like American YouTubers like creating more of a narrative than what was probably there. But after the console market crashed in '83 for North America, once again to be clear, and Nintendo came in '85 and built up that marketplace. Built it back up. They are credited with saving video games in North America, whether that's true or not, which it's not. There was games, especially home like PCs and stuff like that, like computer gaming was still a thing. Hey listeners, future Josh here. Just wanted to add a little bit of context to this, something I didn't really do well when I didn't do well enough in this moment right here. While I still stand by the fact that Nintendo did not necessarily save the video game market in North America, because there was still stuff in the computer games, I am losing a little bit of context. I am missing a little bit of context, where Nintendo did help bring back the console market. Someone would have done it, but Nintendo is the one that ended up doing it, largely through kind of Trojan horsing it into retailers who were afraid to buy console video games, or anything labeled video games was kind of a red flag at the time. So Nintendo did do stuff to revitalize the console market, and I think I didn't have enough context in this moment. So I just wanted to add that in here. So people still wanted to play games, and arcades were still a thing. People still wanted to play games. It's just that they weren't selling consoles. Nintendo just saw the market wasn't there, and they just were like, all right. So they were at the right place at the right time. It also helped that the games are good. Like Mario's a good game. Zelda's a good game. I know they didn't make Mega Man, but like the games that came out on the NES were largely, I wouldn't say largely good, but there's a lot of good ones. But so you have that. So you have an entire generation who their primary entry into video games is Nintendo. And then on top of that, you have Nintendo's business practices back then, which punished third-party developers and it wouldn't allow them onto competing consoles, which is why it's not the only reason, but it's a big reason why the Master System had such a hard time taking off in North America, because they couldn't Sega had to do everything themselves. And then it wasn't until that Nintendo started, they didn't loosen the reins. They kind of the reins were forced to be loosened on them because third-party developers just started moving over anyway. And I guess, wasn't there like some antitrust lawsuits and stuff like that, or like monopoly lawsuits from
there were,
right?
Yep.
So that also helped too. And so you have a whole generation of kids who grew up knowing Nintendo as video games. Nintendo was synonymous as video games because of the circumstances that happened, right? And then that same generation just happened to be graduating college right when the internet and YouTube start to boom, and all of the nerds who were into video production and everything like that, or figured out how to do editing on their camcorders and putting it over to their computer, started uploading to YouTube, and then it went off. And then, like you said, ST1ka, like, and both you and Chris, said, like, the YouTuber thing came right around the mid to late aughts, 2008, 2009, and then here we are. Like, it compounded. And I think I'm just gonna, one of the questions I had kind of in the list I sent you is the Nintendo bump positive, negative, or neutral thing? I think it's pretty. I mean, it's pretty obvious it's a negative thing at this point. Like, it's not like it started out the way. No one meant to like have it. Like you said it yourself, ST1ka, like how no one meant for this to become misinformation. It just kind of happened.
So
exactly.
Yeah. Go ahead, ST1ka.
Yeah, no, exactly. It kind of happened, and now it's exponentially more difficult to unravel it, in my opinion, because once people have accepted something as truth, it just becomes very difficult to unlearn something. Like we were talking, Chris was talking about Earthbound. I would go even further than that. Like, hardly anyone cared or even knew what Chrono Trigger was during the 90s. Like even if you watch this, if you check out its sales outside of Japan, like it sold okay, it sold decently, but like most people didn't play RPGs in consoles back then. Sure, some people did, but it wasn't that popular genre during the 16-bit generation. And even Final Fantasy VI, I might go as far as to say that it became popular because of Final Fantasy VII, and then people started going back. I mean, I'm not saying that there wasn't like a niche or a group that propped up Chrono Trigger, Final Fantasy VI, but it just sort of became famous like later when Square Enix really exploded in the West during the PS1 era, in my opinion.
Yeah, and I think more to that point, you kind of look at that stuff like Chrono Trigger. I think what boosted Chrono Trigger was Final Fantasy VII, but there's a lot of revisionist history in terms of what was popular, because back then fighting games were the dominant force. I'm glad that we brought up the fact that Tekken 2 beat Suikoden, for example, and how nowadays
deservedly,
Suikoden,
like I'm sorry, Kate, but deservedly.
But like, take for example, if you want to talk about fighting games, if you're talking to an average person about with online discourse, right? I know this is a later point, but I just want to get here. I think more people will talk about Killer Instinct or Mortal Kombat than they will Tekken 3. I can tell you, Tekken 3 was a monster. That was a monster release.
Absolutely. Yes.
And it just seems, in terms of online discussions within at least the gamer circles I'm in, I think the gamer circles at large, it's like people forget that Tekken 3 happened. This was both of you were a part of this, and I don't think either of you voted for it, but this game that I'm about to give an example of, but like the Gran Turismo series in the 90s was just absolutely massive.
I was gonna bring this up because it was a big point of contention on. I don't know if you want to spoil the King of Games stuff, because it.
Say what you got to, but
I was just gonna say this is a slight spoiler for those who. Just to, for anyone who may not be on the Retro Hangover Patreon, or it's going to be on on their main feed very soon, they do this King of Games series where you look at a bunch of games from a specific year, and they go to head and determine which game was the King of Games for that year. Well, Chris and I were on an episode for EverQuest versus Gran Turismo 2, and it was a big point of contention. I voted for EverQuest over Gran Turismo 2, but I think I still stand by my vote, but I will at least say that you bring up a very good point where it's like people forget about Tekken 3. Gran Turismo 2, to your point, sold millions of copies and no one remembers it.
It's
More people. Yeah.
I believe
But
it sold more than Final Fantasy and Metal Solid put together. Actually,
it sold. Gran Turismo 2, I think, is the third best-selling game for the console. Number one being
yeah,
Gran Turismo 1,
yeah,
and
that's it.
Final Fantasy 7's number 2 with Final Fantasy 8, I think, is number 4 or 5 with a Harry Potter game somewhere in there, right? But the thing is that if you ask people about PlayStation, they're going to say Final Fantasy 7 and then Final Fantasy 8. And they're not going to say Gran Turismo. I know this is a Nintendo bump conversation, but I think it just goes into how we have a conversation around what games are pushed forward and what games are not.
Well, I think the Nintendo bump is kind of like the lead into a larger conversation, which I think we can have on this episode, or at least like touch on it or whatnot, just about how perception of game history is so altered by various like bumps. And I'm not, everyone has their personal biases. That's a given, right? Everyone's going to have their personal blind spots, this and that. What's interesting is when an entire community, it feels like, or a large section of the community, not an entire community, but a large subset of the community just vehemently thinks that history was one way when data doesn't show the other. And like you were saying, sk1ka, how like people view Banjo-Kazooie selling as much as Croc, right? Or selling, Croc sold more, I believe, or they sold approximately
relatively the same.
Yeah, 3 million each, I believe.
But because Americans idolize the N64, I myself am one of them. I am an N64 apologist. That still doesn't change the fact, though, that they sold the same. Why don't people talk about Croc? Like, arguably, you could use that as a gauge of popularity, but no one idolizes Croc the way they do Banjo-Kazooie.
To be fair, Banjo is a much better game than Croc. But using Chris's Gran Turismo example, I've also had this interaction, which I was like, I don't know, discussing the PlayStation 1 versus the N64, and I used Gran Turismo as an example, and I got the reply, nobody cares about Gran Turismo, which to me is just insane, because
it is insane.
Objectively wrong. Like, I hate racing games. I'm not a fan of them at all. But like,
same here.
Gran Turismo is consistently one of the highest selling series for Sony until they decide to shutter their everything. But fuck them. But that's a different conversation.
You know what argument they made? They said that nobody cares about Gran Turismo, and then they use it as our counterpoint. The amount of speedruns Banjo has versus the amount of speedruns Gran Turismo has. And I'm like,
that doesn't matter.
Right? But like, this is the sort of logic we've gotten to now. Yeah. It is just complete moon logic.
Yeah, it's what is popular on the internet. It determines a game's worth and value at the time it was released. Even like it's nuts.
And I think it's worth having like noting that there are two things can be true at once. A game can be more important now to the public at large than it was at launch, but that still doesn't change the fact of how a game was perceived and accepted or not accepted when it came out. Like those are two distinct points. And almost at one point you have to acknowledge like they're just two different inflection points of history. Like when the game launched and when it had its like coming out party on the internet, like when finally everyone realized, oh, this game's actually really good, or maybe, oh, this is actually a lot better than we thought it was, type of thing.
Absolutely.
Kind of like the swing revival in the 90s, and I don't know if that happened over for you in Europe, sk1ka, but at least in North America, there was a swing revival in the 90s. Did swing exist before the 90s? Yeah. We talk about it. It was in like the 20s and 30s or whatever the fuck. I'm not a music
20s.
History person.
Yeah, 20s.
Yeah, so it happened. It came out in the 20s, but it doesn't. Just because it had a revival in the 90s doesn't mean that all of a sudden the 20s never existed.
Right. To bring up a question you asked earlier about whether or not this is a positive, negative, or neutral thing, and I want to focus strictly on Nintendo here, because I think Nintendo and like the video game crash and just culturally and everything like that, and focus on the negative aspects, because I don't think anything is truly ever negative, but we are circling around a negative thing here. I think the biggest negative thing to come out of the way that we consider Nintendo, revere Nintendo, and how Nintendo has been consumed, especially in the modern age. And this even goes back to how it was contemporaneously, just because we didn't have access to the products, is almost the I don't want to say willful ignorance, but definitely ignorance and naivete to things that helped establish and define the games that we consider to be revolutionary. So I'm going to pick on Zelda because I don't like Zelda, but you look at the original Legend of Zelda and think about how many Americans. I'm going to pick on Americans, North Americans, but specifically Americans because why not? I'm an American, I can do that. Who said like there has been no games like this ever before, and it completely revolutionized the way that people played video games. What a lot of people don't realize is that what they did on the Famicom and Nintendo is they were taking concepts that existed on the PC 98 and PC 88, and they were making them more streamlined because there were less buttons. So they were making them easier for the mass consumer to do. So if you look at, and like these games on PC were also much harder, but like all the bones, all of the structure was there for what these Famicom games were. So go look at Tower of Druaga. Go look at Hydlide. And I have to give a shout out to like Jeremy Parrish. If you watch his channel on YouTube, he points a lot of these things out as well and how they're very inspirational towards a lot of the games we love today. But I like if you bring up Hydlide or you bring up Tower of Druaga to anybody who loves Zelda, like it will just they will look at you like you're crazy. And they'll say, well, I saw a YouTube video about how terrible Hydlide was. What are you talking about? This has anything to do with Zelda. That kind of has the mentality there, because a lot of those games that people haven't played that are important, Dragon Slayer, Xanadu, Hydlide, Draga, Xevious, these games were not gigantic hits in the United States. So we consider the games that are derivative of those efforts as the definitive versions, and nothing came before them. So we say, look at this revolutionary product. Nintendo did it. And because Nintendo was the big company at the time, that was our perspective. So it created series. So when you get to the point in like 1998 where you have The Legend of Zelda, which has to like carried this legacy of the definitive open world adventure because of the impact it made in 1986, 1987 in the United States, it becomes a bigger deal and it carries more gravity. And that's probably why it gets more reverence, as opposed to Japan, where it still gets its credit and reverence, but it may not be as heavy because they did have the context and they did have the procedural gradients in terms of what eventually became Zelda, if that makes sense.
You know what's even funnier though? If people are pushing back against Tower of Druaga, a game which Nintendo did state what they were inspired by, then imagine the ones that they didn't actually state that inspired them, but you just know they did. For example, there is a game on the ColecoVision called give me a second. It's called Alcazar, the Forgotten Fortress.
Right. Yeah, I remember you covering that. Yeah.
If you look at its screenshot, it looks like Zelda. And here's the thing: the game predates like Zelda by a year and a half, or 2 years, whatever. I can't remember right now. It's generally agreed upon that the ColecoVision sort of helped guide the Famicom architecture, because it's somewhat similar. And I find that funny because there is a quote by a Capcom developer saying that Alcazar was an influence for Resident Evil. So it's not like it was just some obscure game that never launched in Japan. Like, we know for a fact that it inspired a major studio, Capcom. And when you put all the pieces together, it's kind of hard to not play Alcazar and think, the dungeon crawling here feels a lot like a prototypical Legend of Zelda. But you try telling anyone that, and they will outright deny it.
Mm-hmm. And I think like it's you're both so spot on. Like I even think about, like you mentioned Tower of Druaga, Chris. One of the big aspects of that was just like playground rumors, right? Like the whole purpose of that game is that you had to rely on the community of people in the real world to beat it, and that's one of the things that people always talk about with the original Legend of Zelda. How you would go to the playground the next day. Sorry, kids in North America would talk about, you go to the playground and you ask your friends like, oh, I burned this bush on this screen and I was able to get here. Like it heavily relied on the communal aspect in order to get through the game. But people always equate that with Nintendo, and when we're missing a lot of the historical context and everything. And I think like it's especially because for the N64, I think the reason it gets so much praise at it is because, I mean, obviously there was 3D games prior to this, like
Mhm.
Absolutely. But because of Mario 64 and Ocarina of Time, I don't know. Do either of you know of any other games that put that much polish on like either the 3D platformer or the 3D adventure game prior to those?
Well, for the 3D platform, it's very difficult. Like closest I can think of is like some obscure platformers on Japanese computers, which were very basic, or jumping flash for the PlayStation. So
Yep.
not quite on the same level. But when it comes to Legends of Zelda, I think suddenly it changed. That really changed a lot because. I think we keep forgetting that Ocarina of Time launched really late into that generation. Like
Yes.
it
98.
launched December of '98, exactly. Like
Mhm.
Sonic Adventure launched the same month, I believe. And I don't know if you ever played Soul River: Legacy of Kain.
I have, unfortunately. Not a fan.
You don't you don't like it? I love that game, man.
No, I with I did an episode on it. I got a review copy of the HD remaster,
hmm
and it wasn't bad. I will say my biggest issues with it were more the platforming was very
Rigid.
rough,
Yeah.
very rigid, and this part was not the game's fault. But I'll tell the story again because I find it humorous. The very first boss of the game, you know, where it's got
hmm
that cage in the center, it's kind of like an arena,
Yeah.
and there's two portcullises on the sides, or maybe three, I don't know, I think there's only two, and you have to jump over a hole in the wall to get to the other side for the monster to come through, and you can close the portcullis on its head, right?
hmm
um in the HD remake, it's too fucking dark to see the holes above the portcullises, so I had no idea I could jump up there because it was just pitch black. So I'm running around. I'm like, what am I supposed to do? I don't understand these mechanics. What's going on? And then I had to look up a guide online, and they said you just jump there. I went, what? There's not. Oh, there is something there, but I can't see because it's just dark. So anyway, that's a digression. But yeah, I was not a fan of it, but I do understand it. Like that's personal taste, not anything to do with its
Mhm.
historical impact.
Like Soul River is basically a mix of Tomb Raider and Legend of Zelda. Like the stiff platforming comes from Tomb Raider, basically. And now here's what I find interesting. Like if I'm not mistaken, like the earliest demo of Soul River actually predates. I believe that actually predates Zelda by a couple of months. Like here it is. Sorry, I was searching while I was talking to you. Okay, the first demo of Soul River was July 1998, and it already had like the lock on targeting, which was very similar to Zelda, and it was already a 3D Legend of Zelda with Tomb Raider platforming. So it's kind of like the the industry was already moving in that direction. Is basically the point that I'm trying to make. Like obviously, Zelda's Ocarina of Time is a great game. It's very polished,
It's fine.
but it gets
Mhm.
but it gets like attributed with creating the lock-on mechanic, the 3D lock-on mechanic, even though it was already becoming somewhat commonplace. I see people say it's like the first time we got a game similar to Zelda or an open world style game in that style. That it was the first game to do it, and it's really not, or at least we were already walking in that direction. Zelda came out pretty much the same month as Sonic, and they too share some similarities, but Soul River came out a little late, but the demos already showed that they pretty much had the
Mhm.
same idea and they were walking in the same direction before Zelda came out. They just launched a little later. Like it was but my point is it was always going to happen. Maybe it might have been a little bit rougher, maybe not as polished, but we were clearly walking that direction.
And I do want to say you're asking if there's been a 3D game that was just as polished. Now, for Mario 64, I think that's a tough argument. And
I
the
agree.
reason why is because it was it the first 3D platform ever? No, but I
No.
think the important thing is it showed how to really incorporate movement in a 3D environment properly,
I
specifically
agree.
because they had the analog stick, and it was
Mhm.
the introduction. Now they didn't get it perfect by a mile, but it was the introduction on how to start looking at how to incorporate a camera in a 3D environment properly. I think
Mhm.
when you look at those two elements, I think it really informed the future of just not platformers, but 3D environment as a whole and how to improve upon it. So that's why I think Super Mario 64, I give all the kudos to it. I give it this flowers 100%, nothing to take away from it. But in terms of The Legend of Zelda, I think one, and this kind of goes more into the direct focus of the Nintendo bump, is that Nintendo knows how to build hype. And one of the things about building hype is that they didn't have as many releases on the N64 as perhaps the PlayStation did. And this kind of goes back to the Super Nintendo too. And this is from a YouTube video I saw a long time ago. I wish I could give it credit, but it make the perfect analogy for what was happening between Sega and Nintendo during the 16-bit wars, is that Nintendo would come out with an A+ title maybe once a quarter or twice a year, and and Sega would come out with a B+ effort at least once a month. So no, you're not getting the same quality or same polish as you would from a Nintendo game, but you're getting more of it and you're getting it more often, which is exactly the same thing that you're kind of seeing going through the Nintendo 64 and PlayStation era, except by that point, most people had jumped over to PlayStation. But I think when you're asking it polished by this point, Zelda had the hype, Zelda had the reputation, Zelda had the name familiarity, but Metal Gear Solid and Half-Life are far more polished than Zelda, and they came out the same year.
Half-Life came out the same year as Ocarina of Time?
Yes.
It did.
That's fucking, that hurts my brain to think about.
See, that's the thing. People like, we tend to I can't say this word in English. Compartmentalize. Thank you. Like gaming history, and we forget, like, it's very free flowing. Like, we tend to associate Virtua Fighter 2 and Nintendo USA with the Sega Saturn, like 95, 96, maybe 97. No, those games launched in 93. People like, that's the same year Star Fox came out. Like we were already playing Virtua Fighter 2, like not even the first one, the sequel, and Daytona USA the same year that Star Fox came out. There were already a lot of 3D advancements being made, and I don't just mean like technology or texture filtering, like just the controls for those games.
Yeah, Virtua Racing came out, I think, in 92. And that's why, and Star Fox came out in 93, and that was kind of Nintendo's response to Virtua Racer. But by that point, Virtua Fighter had came out and just kind of blown the lid off of everything. But the reason Star Fox was so big, Nintendo bump, is it was on the Super Nintendo. And it did a better job of showcasing 3D effects than Virtua Racer did, certainly on the Sega Genesis.
Absolutely.
I guess it just goes to show that a lot, like even some of the Nintendo bump just comes from being at the right place at the right time. Like specifically with Ocarina of Time, right? Like all those things happened around the same time, but because of the Nintendo bump, it gets credited to Ocarina of Time. Which then, of course, adds to the Nintendo bump. So it's like they benefit from it, and it compounds it as well. And that's really interesting. So that's why I wanted to ask about specifically Mario 64 and Ocarina, because like I always see those points of contention. It's like, well, they weren't the first to do it, and I'm like, well, I always assumed that I understood at the time they weren't the first to do it, but like, were they one of the ones that had some seminal leap or some type of like level of polish that you had not seen before? And Mario 64, I mean, who knows, maybe we'll find something, in another year or so that has like the same level of polish that Mario 64 did and no one realized it. But that's very interesting. And I think also, like, to put that in perspective, I think to continue along with this conversation with the Nintendo bump, another one of your viral posts, st1ka, that I know got people really worked up, and I was one of the people. I just don't comment because I don't feel but I also realize I'm not well equipped enough to debate anything with this, is Saturn versus 64. And Chris, I believe you fall on the same side as st1ka on this, where this Saturn was a much better and more prolific system than the N64 was. And I can't even argue with it. I'm not even bringing this up to argue the point, because I don't know Saturn's library enough, and I don't know its interpretation, like how it's perceived outside of North America enough. But I think but I still think it's a good example of this Nintendo bump where the Saturn, like, there's a bunch of games on it that nobody in North America knows much about, mainly because Sega of America kind of fucked up its launch. But that doesn't change the fact about how good or bad the system was. You know what I mean? Like what are the games on it, type of thing. And that's why I was kind of more curious to hear from both of you on this, like how the Nintendo bump affected Saturn in an essence, whether contemporary at the time or now even.
I'll let you
Honestly,
start with this, skewed.
Thank you. I would say at the time, Sega was the one who affected the Saturn, not
Yes.
really Nintendo. So, like, not just Sega of America, Sega of Europe. This just seemed completely absent during this time as well. So just Sega, basically all of Sega except Sega of Japan and maybe Sega of Portugal. They actually did a very good job at selling the Saturn. But when we jump to now, basically I've noticed that the Sega Saturn is very popular in the more hardcore retro gaming crowd.
Yeah.
But the more I don't want to say casual because it seems like I'm insulting people, but like the less hardcore you get, the more perceptions start to shift that the Saturn was a terrible system, that the N64 was the good system. It's once again based on perceptions, and I think again that it mostly comes down to people like maybe who don't have time to play the games or don't want to go through the effort of setting up an emulator, which historically playing Saturn on an emulator used to be very difficult. Thankfully, it's easy now. So I would say there's like a very large majority of retro gamers who never played the Saturn, played a bit of the N64, but mostly get their information from YouTubers, and so they just sort of assume that the Saturn kind of sucks.
Yeah, I would agree with pretty much everything skewed said. I think, keep in mind that a lot of the perception on how the Saturn is received or was received is based off of how it did in North America, which was bad. And skewed already said it, like, this is a Sega problem. Like, Nintendo had nothing to do with this. The Nintendo bumper, the perception of Nintendo, because remember, Nintendo got stomped too by Sony.
Yep.
So it really wasn't Nintendo's issue. The thing is with Sega, and I agree, and I'll say more casual. I don't think there's anything wrong with being a casual. I think that's fine. But like the more casual crowd, because you're not getting the Saturn presence in North America. And like for many people who promoted the Saturn for the longest time pointed to Knights. I don't think Knights is a bad game, but it's certainly not the game that's going to win over the Saturn.
I agree.
It's not the showpiece. So when people are like, yeah, Knights, Daytona USA, and Virtua Fighter 2, especially with an audience that has a constantly degrading thought process about fighting games, particularly older ones, that's not a high pitch to the Saturn. And also the Saturn did have a lot of its very good games are on the arcade side, and the arcade is very popular more among the hardcore crowd, and it's just not going to resonate with more casual fans. And emulation will assist a console that no one's ever heard of before greatly if you can do it correctly, and the Saturn's never been there. Ironically, neither has the N64. That has a lot of problems in emulation, even to this day. But like in terms of the Sega Saturn, yeah, it's just totally the fact that it was never really successful in the West. I know that in the I had a conversation with skewed before where in Portugal he said it started out very, very well. He just said that a few moments ago. But like just the rest of the continent didn't have support and just dropped it. And what's ironic, I won't say ironic, but what's sad, I'll say more sad, is that a lot of the people that like to drum up the Mega Drive, especially over there in Europe, and talk about how dominant the Mega Drive was, and a lot of the Sega fans in North America that like to talk about how awesome the Genesis was, they'll just pretend that the Saturn doesn't even exist, which is just mind-blowing to me.
I agree.
You would have a follow-up to a console and just have this giant gap where you just like, I don't know what came after the Genesis and before the Dreamcast. Like, you are fucking kidding me. Like, that's impossible.
Now, if it helps, I also have hot takes that Sega fans usually don't like. For example, I've said it time and time again, I think the Dreamcast was Sega's weakest system. So that's one of my hot takes there.
I mean, it's not weaker than the SG-1000.
Okay, yeah. I'm just counting the main four home consoles, not the Game Gear either. But I do think it's weaker than the Master System, to be honest.
It is Sega's worst selling console,
Yeah,
outside of the SG-1000.
but like a lot of the issues I have with the N64, and I don't mean like Nintendo bump, just like issues with the game library and the games themselves, also apply to the Dreamcast. Like I hate that controller. I hate that it only has one analog stick. I feel the library is aging very poorly, in my opinion. Much
Mm.
like the N64 library, much like the PS1 library. Like that era of early 3D gaming, it's showing its age very quickly, in my opinion. Whereas the Saturn has a lot of 2D games, so I feel it aged better. So I have a lot of issues with the Dreamcast, and I own a Dreamcast, and I like my Dreamcast, but I've played way too many games on it that I'm like, man, this is not as good as I remember it to be.
See, it's funny. I've actually been getting more into N64 and PS1 stuff more recently, but that's that. Like, the graphics definitely haven't aged well, but now it's just nostalgia speaking at this point, not
Yeah.
even like anything else. But no, I'm glad we talked about this though, because like I thought. Like one of the impetuses for this episode was that post Tika, like about the N64 and the Saturn, just because I was
Hmm.
like, man, like I don't know, the Saturn really doesn't. But I had that same perception of most other people in North America. I'm like, what are you talking about? N64. But like to the point you made earlier, Chris, and I remember saying this with my friend Tristan, who's been a guest on the show before, because the GameCube was very much like the N64 in that there wasn't a lot of good games on it. But when there was a good game, holy shit, it was like one of the top tier. It was an A+ game. But it was so few and far between with all of those that it would take a while to actually get to those good ones, versus you would have I think that analogy of Sega release a B+ game every single month is really good, because it feels like the other consoles, not Nintendo during this era, were doing that. Nintendo would release really good games, but if it wasn't Rare or Nintendo on the N64, there's some exceptions, of course. I'm not saying all of them. I'm a fan of like Toy Story 2 and The World Is Not Enough on the N64, but that's just two games, right, out of a whole
Hmm.
library of a couple hundred that aren't Rare or Nintendo. Um, so yeah, it it I think the N64. I think there's no greater example of the Nintendo bump than the era of Nintendo between the N64 and the GameCube. And oddly
Yes.
enough, one of their best-selling consoles, the Wii,
Hmm.
doesn't seem to have that much traction in the gaming zeitgeist. The,
Wii Sports is
would you guys
about it.
agree?
Yeah. I would 100% agree with you, actually. And because when you were bringing that up, I was thinking to myself, is there like what's the quota on games on the N64 that weren't made by Nintendo that people care about to this day and want to say that are really good?
Besides Rare as well, because that
Well, I
was
mean,
like,
because it published by Nintendo, because Rare games
hmm,
were published by Nintendo. So by proxy, they're Nintendo games because they're
oh,
promoted by
okay,
Nintendo. If they sell well, it benefits Nintendo. And I think what a lot of people forget too is that Nintendo had one of the biggest magazines in rotation as a primary advertising conduit. Like
mm-hmm.
it was out there exclusively Nintendo, like hyping up and promoting Nintendo games throughout that entire time. Now they were doing that before that, of course, and like there's no denying that. But video games were also getting bigger, and so this was probably a gigantic magazine in rotation in North America, alongside other magazines like EGM, Game Pro, and Game Informer. But I would say one of the biggest things was Nintendo was very good at generating hype for
Hmm.
its own games, and when it gets to a point where Sega shot themselves in the foot, in the knee, name a body part, Sega's just doing everything it can to maim itself. uh PlayStation is stepping up and it's stealing that audience that was considered to be more mature, which at that time, because gaming was just becoming mainstream, a lot of those people moving forward aren't going to be as passionate about games when you're creating content and videos in the 2010s, as we just kind of tying this back to the beginning, when they're coming out of college and they're being these film majors and they're making YouTube videos and they're trying to get into this new medium. Like a lot of people are going to remember the Nintendo 64 fondly because it was targeted towards them, whereas PlayStation wasn't, with few exceptions, and a lot of those exceptions being covered with Crash Bandicoot and Spyro, right? But Nintendo, the hype machine, and how they could target out that audience, how they could get into the zeitgeist of hype and develop that within the video gaming, sphere it's a masterclass in how to do it. Like, they were the best at doing that. And this is where I'm going to pick on Donkey Kong 64. And I know you love Donkey Kong 64. I am picking on Donkey Kong 64.
By all means.
Nintendo, and this is a rare game, Nintendo hyped the absolute shit out of Donkey Kong 64. If you look back at any magazine of the time, it just absolutely like gassed it up to the point where it got rave reviews. It was very highly reviewed and it sold a ton. But then like 6 months later, the reviewers started saying, yeah, hopefully things will be better than Donkey Kong 64 in the future. That was kind of bad. And it's kind of like that's when if in a vacuum, if you kind of look back at the N64 and the major releases, you can say that a lot about a lot of the very popular N64 games, especially if you try to go back and play them today. I would say that would probably be more relatable the closer you get. I would say that's with few, like there are exceptions for the GameCube releases, but I think by the time it got to the GameCube, reviewers, I don't want to say willingly, but Nintendo had fallen out of favor for Sony significantly because everyone knew who the big, the big guy was on the block. So now they didn't have to kiss Nintendo's ass anymore because they knew who was in charge. But during the N64, especially in the United States, it was kind of up in the air, even though it wasn't. You saw like this willingness to really defend Nintendo because they did it so well. But then like, yeah, just go back and again, compare The Legend of Zelda Ocarina of Time, which I'm not saying is a bad game, but compare it to the level of polish and just overall direction and how the game was put together compared to Metal Gear Solid. And tell me that it's a significantly better game. I don't see it. And maybe that's just a me thing, but like Metal Gear Solid, I think is a significantly more important game in terms of the trajectory of video games than Ocarina of Time was.
I usually making an argument that a lot of people just don't seem to agree, or at least goes over their heads. But like, I have made this argument a lot of times, which I think one of the most important games that generation, and it might have actually been more influential than Mario 64. Even though we don't see it unless we actually start looking for it, was the original Tomb Raider, which it controls very stiff. Yes, I agree. Mm-hmm. But like, if you play any modern game today, the design is modeled after Tomb Raider, not Mario 64. Like for example, first off, okay, just in terms of theme, Tomb Raider was more adult, more regular. Like you're closer to something like Uncharted, for example, or like The Last of Us. Like all of these Sony modern action adventure games basically trace their lineage back to Tomb Raider. But not just that. Like, think about how the levels were formed in Tomb Raider. Like in Mario 64, the first stage, you gotta climb the top of the hill, beat the bomb boss. What's his name again? The king boss, the king bomb, whatever his name was.
King Babam.
King Babam.
Yep.
Gotta beat him. Second level, you gotta race a turtle. Like, it's very linear. With Tomb Raider, it's like, okay, you have this level, but you can go outside of the beaten path and find an item that you can store in an inventory, so you don't have to use it. It can be a healing item or a weapon that you'll never find again if you don't pick it up now. Or maybe it's a bonus item for the secret ending, because there's bonus statues in the entire game. And in the level, you got to activate a switch that opens the door to platform to a certain path, to pick up a key, then you have to go back, then you got to solve a puzzle. Like, it's a series of actions to beat a level, which is basically how modern games are designed. Like, not the control, but the themes and how games are designed.
And the pacing.
I would argue. Yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
Well, I would also argue like the importance of Tomb Raider, and like I don't think Tomb Raider is a better game than Mario 64.
No, it's not. It's not.
I think I don't. But I think like a lot of people undersell the importance of Tomb Raider.
Yeah.
which was
Uh-huh.
a major culturally important game to the point it stemmed film franchises. That game was
Mhm.
just insanely massive. And I think when you talk about Tomb Raider today, and I think it's because it's just they've managed to properly so
Yeah.
haphazardly, it's
Yeah.
been up and down a lot. But like I think people forget just how big of a game Tomb Raider really was, especially comparatively. That game was, I think, more people probably played Tomb Raider than Mario 64 for a
It's
while.
it's possible. I mean, it was on 3 different systems, so it's definitely
Yeah.
possible.
Mhm.
But like, I just feel that a lot of what we have for modern game design today basically was propped up by Tomb Raider. Obviously, Tomb Raider was not the first game to do it, but it was probably the first one that became a mainstream cultural hit. So a lot of studios then
Yeah.
started copying Tomb Raider.
I would call
I
Tomb Raider the first AAA game.
It's
I
it's
don't think
possible.
you're wrong though, because specifically Uncharted, which is kind of like Uncharted, I feel like kind of set off what's became like the standard Sony third person action adventure game,
Hmm.
right? Like that, the success of that series, they were heavily inspired by Tomb Raider. It's not, and that's not like up for debate. Like that's they've said it, and on top of that, like it's you play as as a male Lara Croft, basically. You're
Hmm.
raiding tombs, like that's what Nathan Drake does, right? So I could totally see that, and I think to bring it back to Nintendo, just something that you both it made me think about it. Like, we there's so much reverence for the N64 and the GameCube, and part of that I do agree with you is do agree with you, Chris, is that Nintendo knows how to hype things. I also think part of it is human nature in the sense that when you love something and you feel it's not getting a fair shake, you will die on a hill, on every hill you can possibly find
Can
to
confirm.
stand up for it. And I honestly, what kind of made me start thinking about that was when you brought up Donkey Kong 64, because I'm one of those people who will die on the hill that Donkey Kong 64 is a
Yeah.
good game. With that said, though, why do I feel like that? It's because I feel it's being being given a short shrift, or it's fun to people make fun of it too much now, so I feel the need to defend it. So if you look at how we kind of started this conversation, right? How we were talking about how you have a whole era, a whole generation of kids growing up with the NES and Super Nintendo, coming of age right during the YouTube boom, right? Coming in right out of college right during the YouTube boom. You also have that same group of kids who clearly were devoted to Nintendo, uh, grew up at two of Nintendo's lower points, where they had to feel the need to justify buying their N64 or their GameCube to maybe their other friends who were maybe just getting into games, who were like, "Man, you still play Nintendo? Like that's for kids," type of thing, because it was still marketed for kids, as you said, Chris, and the others were marketed towards adults. So I think that weird thing had a 2-point like effect, where on one end, not like the consoles that were marketed towards adults don't have as much cultural zeitgeist now, because you didn't hook them while they're young, as gross as that sounds.
Right.
You didn't get them like into your ecosystem at a young age, so they don't have that same level of like loyalty in a weird sense. And on top of that, there's nothing meaner than people in their late teens and early 20s trying to
Yeah.
figure out like who they are as humans, right? I feel like a lot of times you don't really kind of understand yourself until you're a couple years older. And you're also, I mean, speaking from experience, you're at your most snobby when you're that age too, because you like what you like, and you are certain that the stuff you like is erudite or whatever the fuck. Like you're smart because you like it, type of thing. So you combine all of that
The
with,
world doesn't understand, man.
yeah, exactly. Very emo and whatnot. So you combine all of that with a generation of kids who grew up with Nintendo, who, when Nintendo hit their low points, all their maybe non-gaming friends started getting into stuff because it was now geared towards them. And then they had to justify their love of Nintendo. And then they started making video game content in in the YouTube boom. I feel like I don't know for certain. I'm kind of just, speculating. I'm throwing it out into the air. Like, could that be it? But I feel like that would have something to do with it. I don't know. Do you guys agree with that?
It's definitely possible. Like one thing that I've noticed, and I feel like this is a bit of a tangent, but like whenever like people are arguing Sega versus Nintendo, one argument that Nintendo fans will always use is, "Oh yeah, well, but which one sold better? Like which one won the generation?" But whenever the argument shifts to the N64 or the GameCube, suddenly sales don't matter. I don't know if you guys ever caught that one.
I mean, yeah. I mean, I haven't caught. I've never debate people online because I don't like arguing. But
Understandable.
I like having conversations like this where we can go back and forth and talk about our viewpoints and everything, and it's a lot more. I don't know. I find this part fun. I don't like the angry part on
Right.
Blue Sky or whatever. But I do think something that really kind of adds to the Nintendo bump thing. Like the way people look at the Super Nintendo versus the Mega Drive / Genesis, right?
Mm-hmm.
And specifically like the Genesis. The reason I say the Genesis and not the Mega Drive because Mega Drive was popular in Europe and Brazil. Like outside the US, it was like much more popular, right? With that said, it was still
Not in
popular
Japan.
as the Genesis here
Yeah, not
in
in
North
Japan.
America. What? Sorry,
Not in Japan. Japan, it was a dumpster fire.
Yeah, not
Okay.
in Japan.
not in Japan. I don't think I think anyone who like don't get me wrong, you can like the Super Nintendo more than the Genesis. It's totally fine, but you're kidding yourself if you don't understand the importance of the Genesis, considering how much of a stranglehold Nintendo had on the game market in North America in the late 80s and early 90s, and the fact that they were able to out of seemingly nowhere, right? They had the Master System, which was a flash in the pan in North America, and then within one console generation was able to market their way into not just relevance, into taking the mantle from Nintendo for a year or so, where they had the majority of the market share. That's fucking crazy. Like, I don't think people give Sega enough credit for that. Like, Sega fans obviously love Sega for various reasons, but I feel like just in general, that's crazy to think about. Like, that is such a disruption to a market to like go from less than like what, probably 5% of the market share to over 50 in 2 years. Like, that's crazy.
I would also state that's also a Western perspective because if you go to Japan, the Genesis, well, the Mega Drive was behind the PC Engine in terms of popularity.
Well, no, I'm strictly speaking about the North American market here.
Sure,
I'm not talking
sure.
about worldwide. That's
Okay.
why I specified the Genesis and not like the
Okay.
Mega Drive / Genesis overall.
Fair.
I'm just saying that because it's weird that Nintendo still gets that bias when if you like for that era when you look at what Sega did, like, because remember the Nintendo bump largely comes from a North American bias, right? So it's weird that it still has that bias for that era when you just look at how much Sega did within like one console generation in North America.
I would actually argue, yes, the Super Nintendo comes out ahead of the Genesis when you're discussing that era of games, specifically from an American perspective, but like the Genesis actually gets some kudos. So I'm not like, is there a bit of a Nintendo bump? You could argue that, but also there's reasons for that, I think. And I do think Sega gets a lot of the credit that Sega deserves. Maybe not all of it, because I think a lot of people don't realize that Sega was ahead from like 91 to 94. And then
something like that, yeah.
It was insane, like the majority of the Super Nintendo's lifespan. But I mean, also people forget that the Genesis wasn't anything until Sonic the Hedgehog came out, because it was on the market for 2 years prior to that.
Yeah.
But like
Altered Beast, anyone?
Yeah. Well, yeah. No one. Yeah. Well, it just had the advantage of going up against Keith Courage in Alpha Zones, which was the TurboGrafx 16 offering, which I like, but yeah. But like once you get to 1994, like Sega started just kind of, I mean, it's aging hardware that by that point, by those standards, the Genesis was from 1987. They didn't really have anything in the pipeline. Their biggest game was Aladdin, which was a third-party offering, and Sonic 3 and Sonic and Knuckles. And outside of that, what do they really have in terms of what was a major hit? I mean, not much. They had good games because they had Vector Man and Ristar and They like some people like Beyond Oasis. I'm not one of them, but a lot of people
To
do.
be fair, the best Genesis game came out in '94, even though it didn't sell very well. But it came out in '94, and it's called Contra Hardcore.
Ooh, the Japanese version, I might be with you on.
Actually, I prefer the American version. I think it's better without the health bar.
You're hardcore, Stika. You are hardcore.
Yeah.
But you have to remember, like, once Donkey Kong Country came out, it was. I think the turning point in that generation may have been Star Fox or Donkey Kong Country, because at that point Nintendo started taking over every region. But I do think Sega gets the kudos there. I do think they get a lot of respect. Maybe not as much as they should, but you cannot say Super Nintendo for anyone who had one during that time without someone immediately thinking about the Sega Genesis.
Now,
and I'll directly contribute that to Sonic the Hedgehog too. I'm not even going to
be
words.
fair, there is a bit of a bump with the Super Nintendo, which doesn't get discussed very, very often because it very easily drifts into conspiracy theories. But like, let me ask you this: how many units did the Sega Genesis sell? Do you know?
What about 40, 50 million? 40 million?
Usually most numbers say 29, 30 million, but the truth is we don't know how many systems were sold.
Yeah.
And like even if you go to Wikipedia, it says 30 million, but then it adds 5 million from Brazil alone, which means it's 35 million. But for some reason it tells you 30 million. But then it also adds 1.5 million from the Majesco release of the Genesis 3. So technically it's now 36 million or whatever. But then it's also not counting other countries. For example, in my country, we had a Mega Drive, but we also had something called the Mega Game, which it was basically a Mega Drive clone, which was sold officially as a Mega Drive.
Huh.
And my country is not alone in that. Like, if you go to the Middle East, Russia, whatever, there's a lot of Mega Drives being sold that may or may not be official, but they're not called Mega Drive. And those aren't counted as well. So, like, the real issue is we don't know how many systems were sold. And most sources only count the US as 20 million, the Europe's like 8 or 7 million, I think, and the 3 million from Japan or so, and that's it. Like they don't count like the rest of the world, or they separate Brazil for some reason. Like they don't count the Genesis 3. Like it's we don't know how many systems were actually sold. It's very weird.
Wild. I don't, and I think that might be like a good transition. It's not a one-to-one thing, but like one of the negative things that you brought up at the very beginning of the episode, Stika, about the negative side effect of the Nintendo bump, right? As we're trying to deconstruct this, is that it not on purpose, but it inadvertently erases other parts of game history. Now, I'm not saying the Nintendo bump is doing this for this specific element of the Genesis sales numbers, but I do think it illustrates a larger point that, like, who's investigating this? Not as many people are, because so many people are focused on Nintendo. The one positive thing I can say about the Nintendo bump is that it gets people into game history in general, because there's people who remember Nintendo, and then that's a gateway. It's a good gateway into being interested into game history. It kind of just stops at that. It seems like it's people don't necessarily talk about the other elements of it, right? Like the fact that we don't really know how much or how many Mega Drives were sold. It's not, once again, that's not a result of the Nintendo bump. I'm not trying to equate that one-to-one, but I do think it kind of illustrates a point of just like, where are we going? Where are we looking at in terms of game history stuff? And I mean, I love what they do, the Video Game History Foundation, but they're big presentations they do periodically. The two that I've seen, one was a Nintendo Power retrospective, which Nintendo Power is super important, don't get me wrong. And the other one was Monkey Island with Ron Gilbert, where he actually had the source code and stuff like that. Very cool, but still very North American centric. And they do a good job at trying to branch out, but like you can see they're using those two presentations as a way to market their nonprofit, right? And what are they marketing towards? The things that are going to get people interested, which seems to be Nintendo, and that's where it stops. And I feel like that's where kind of that Nintendo bump is a detriment. As much as it can get people in the doorway, how many people are then diving further in, you know?
Yeah. What I think like a lot of people need to do is, you know, because we've talked a lot about YouTube. Look for those YouTube channels that talk about a lot of the more obscure things. I'm going to kiss your ass for a second here, but go check out Stika's channel. There's a channel I like called Basement Brothers that covers a lot of the PC 88 and 98 releases. And if you care about video game history and want the full perspective and want to know, you know, why, you know, video games are bigger than Nintendo, or kind of understand like the blind spot that causes Nintendo to get all the reverence it does in North America, until we start learning about the PC 88, the PC 98, the MSX, the Sharp 68,000, the Sharp X 68,000, you can't really have a truly honest discussion about the complete history of video games. And I need to include, you know, the Commodore 64, the ZX Spectrum, the Magnavox Odyssey. A lot of these things people just love to give lip service to, but they never really consider like the progression and how it informed everything else. And until like people are really willing to do that, Nintendo is constantly going to get propped up in a way that's going to kind of rewrite history that is way more favorable to it than maybe it perhaps should be. And I think a lot of that also is, you know, going back to the YouTube creators. And I think to your point about the passionate early 20s, late teens, is that people were making these videos when YouTube was still young and burgeoning, and a lot of people were developing their taste in creators, that they made such a passionate pitch about a lot of these Nintendo games that it was almost impossible for a lot of these people grasping onto these concepts to not kind of adapt some of that passion into themselves for a concept they hadn't completely realized yet.
I definitely think that's a huge part of it. I've talked about it before on, I don't know if it was Patreon or on my main show, but misplaced nostalgia, right? Feeling nostalgic for something you never personally experienced.
Yep.
Retro gaming YouTube really does that. Like, that's not an insult to it. I'm not trying to say that as like to denigrate it. Like, I didn't grow up with the NES. I started with the N64, hence, you know, my love of it. But, the NES, I still played over at friends' house and stuff like that. I just didn't have that same emotional connection to it. And watching stuff like that really built an emotional connection. And it's a shame that, like, as Americans, as to insult our country for myriad of reasons, but at least right now, we can't speak any other fucking language than English, with the exception of a large population does speak Spanish, but most North Americans cannot speak. Most Americans, excuse me. I'm not going to lump Canada in with this. Most, I mean,
they're kind of there too.
They're kind of there too. Yeah.
Yeah.
We can't speak anything other than English. So there's a lot of there's who is it? There is someone who followed me who listened to my World of Warcraft podcasts. I forget his name is Retro Raider. He's a YouTuber. He's got like 10,000 subscribers, but I forget where he's from.
He's from Portugal. I know that.
He's from Portugal. Okay.
Yeah, he is.
Yeah. He commented on some of the stuff and we were chatting a little bit, but I subscribed to him, but I can't read. I don't speak Portuguese, and so that's a huge segment of video game history. And like, I don't know if he does like history stuff. He seems to be kind of doing more like standard gaming YouTube things, but like that's like that I can't have access to, and that's not me blaming the other creators, right? Like, Stika, I'm so grateful you do your channel in English, or at least I apologize if there's other videos that you do that are in Portuguese, but like
it's all in English. Yeah.
I appreciate that, because it's a perspective that we would not get, but that's really not fair to the other content creators who either don't want to and they shouldn't have to do their channel in English, and anything like that. Like there's a lot of stuff that like we just don't have access to, because the algorithm doesn't feed it to us, or because we can't speak any other language other than English because we're fucking stupid. Well, all right, I won't be that harsh, but we don't speak any other language other than English. And so then even if we do find something, then we can't understand it. And then what do we keep getting fed? The same recycled Nintendo focused content. Every now and then you get a Sega fan, but it's usually retro focused once again. Shout out to G from G to the Next Level. He's a friend of mine. His channel's great.
It is.
But yeah, so it's just frustrating. All right, let me
sorry, yeah. The links I posted there was the Mega Game, was from a system called the Mega Game in my country. And to be clear, this is not a bootleg. This was sold by Sega of Portugal, but it's not called a Mega Drive, but it's a Mega Drive. And it's kind of like, did this count towards the total sales? I don't know, but there were other countries who did this, for example.
And to make a counterpoint, to be more fair to Nintendo with the Nintendo bump in nostalgia, we don't know how many Dendies were sold either.
Yeah, but Dendy is a bootleg. That's a fake.
Absolutely,
But this is not a bootleg. This was sold by Sega of Portugal. They sold the Mega Drive 2 and the Mega Game 2. And it's like, does this count? I don't know. Like, I was told that the insides are. I was told that the insides of this system is the official hardware, just with a different.
Why would they market it differently?
I don't know. Nobody knows. But like, I've seen other countries who did this as well. But like, they're not bootlegs because they were sold by the Sega officials of that country. So it's very weird.
That's wild,
right? And I would love to give them information, but good luck interviewing the old Sega of Portugal, because they do not give interviews. So I have no idea. But like,
I'm
even
assuming
if
you've tried too.
Everyone's tried, yeah. Like, even if you look at the controllers, at the electronics, or the inside of the box, it's a Mega Drive game. Like, it even has the stickers from the official Sega of Portugal. Like, we don't know why this happened. It's super weird.
That's so strange.
Supposedly it was officially licensed by Sega, but like, does it count towards the sales of the Genesis / Mega Drive? We don't know. But this is just from my country. There's other examples.
That's just crazy.
Right?
That's crazy. I don't really have anything else to really dive into with this. Do you guys have anything you would like to add? Because I feel like the last question I had on the outline is like, how is this affecting online discourse? I feel like we've kind of gone over it. But is there anything that you guys would like to touch on still? Like, there's no time that we can keep going for longer, but we got through the questions I want to ask. I'm really enjoying this discussion, but I want to give the floor over to both of you if there's anything else you would like to dive into.
Honestly, don't know. I think I've got everything as well, at least on my end.
I guess I'll just put in some parting words. When looking retrospectively at video games, specifically the Nintendo 64 generation, but all generations, consider the source. Consider the country of origin. Consider the cultural attitudes that may be that may exist around that perspective, and then try to find a different perspective from another country. Always take multiple sources and multiple perspectives before making some sort of decision about what gaming was like and what was considered good or not good, or where everything was at. There's so many games out there that don't get talked about. There's so many important games that are forgotten. And just try, if you love gaming, if you love the history of gaming, just take in as much information as possible and realize no one source is the definitive one. The only way that you can fix that is by digesting as much as possible.
Absolutely. And media literacy, not just in games, is important. Everywhere is important, especially
that too.
In the world we live right now. But I'm with you on that, Chris. And with that in mind, I'd actually like to shout out my guest from 2 episodes ago, which at the time we're recording this is not out yet. Future Josh here. Just a quick correction. The episode I'm referring to with Lane Nooney just came out last week. That's it. That's the correction. back to the episode. I want to shout out my guest Lane Nooney from 2 weeks ago. Lane is the managing editor of RomChip, which is, I don't know, have either of you ever heard of RomChip?
I have not.
Nope.
So RomChip is like an academic journal, kind of like what they would do with, like the scientific journals for, academics in science or history or whatnot. It's an academic journal, but about game history. So they release, I think, only 2 volumes like a year type of thing. It's very slow release, but they have like peer reviewed and peer edited articles, and they do a combination of different things. So I did a whole interview with Lane 2 weeks ago that if you all have not listened to, I highly recommend checking out. They were a wonderful guest, and we talked all about the creation of RomChip, why it's important, and the reason I bring it up, not just because we're talking about like perceptions of games history through the Nintendo bump and everything, but they do bring people in from other, like they'll translate interviews from other languages. They'll first release they'll share an interview in its original language. Like they had one with I think a couple French developers. I don't even remember. Hold on, let me see. I have it here. It was from leisure electronics to game creation, and it's Daniel Rue's role in Swiss game history. So that's just an example. So they have the original one, I guess, in French. I think it was in French. Yeah, it was in French. And then they have a translated version of it in English. But RomChip does a whole bunch of things, and it's supposed to bring this type of academic, rigorous, peer edited review to game history, which I think is kind of cool. And they do try to branch out to people outside of a North American perspective. So if you're looking for a good starting point to that stuff that is already in English, one, check out ST1ka's channel, which
thank you.
I'll give you a chance to shout out at the end of the episode again, but also check out RomChip. They do some cool stuff over there. But yeah, I think then I think that'll do it then for this episode of Still Loading. I think that's all we got on that. I don't know if the Nintendo bump is fully deconstructed, but we at least have, I think this is a good starting off point for anyone interested in like kind of thinking about this type of stuff, like looking into this, talking about it. I think this was a really fun and worthwhile conversation. So thank you both for joining me on this episode. I really appreciate it. I guess to wrap it up, though, we should do some shout outs and plugs and whatnot. So I'm going to start off with Chris, with you. Where can the good people find you online, and what would you like to promote?
Well, first of all, thanks for having me on today, Josh. I appreciate it. I always love stopping by and chatting with you. It's always a great time. But if you want to know more of the things that I do, you can find it at the Retro Hangover podcast, which is over at linktr.ee/Retro Hangover. I don't want to say it's a standard fare retro gaming podcast, but that's kind of what we are. We take a game and we review it, like any game that's over 10 years old. We also have a top 5 list podcast that runs alternate weeks to the main podcast. We just count down a top 5 of topics that our wild Patreon members suggest, like most bangable Final Fantasy characters. Thanks everybody. But yeah, if you want to check that out, go to linktr.ee/Retro Hangover, and I look forward to you listening to that, and thank you in advance. So there you go.
All right. And of course, for our first time guest on the show, ST1ka, thank you for joining us on this. I'm so happy to have you on the show for this one. Where can the good people find you online? And is there anything you'd like to promote?
Well, first I have one question for Chris. Did you give the side eye to whoever voted for Red 13?
Gave the side eye whoever voted for what?
For Red 13 as the most bangable character in Final Fantasy?
No one voted for that. No one voted for that.
Okay, because I know the internet that somebody would have voted for Red 13.
Hey, Rule 34 exists for a reason, man.
It does. But yeah, to answer your question, I have a YouTube channel. It's called ST1ka. That's ST1KA. It's basically does a lot of reviews and occasionally documentaries. I try to focus on gaming history that people that is generally not covered. So I covered a lot of bootleg games. I've covered gaming history from Portugal, Brazil, Greece, a bit of South Korea, a bit of China. I try to find hidden gems, like the most the most obscure stuff that you've never heard about. Just like basically, if I feel that something isn't talked about enough, I try to cover it. That's basically the how that channel works.
I highly recommend checking out, obviously, both Chris's and st1ka's stuff. But st1ka, I found you through your bootleg Mega Man games that you did. I forget how many years, like a year or two ago now.
That one's quite a bit old, yeah. But yeah. I love covering bootleg games.
So please go check out all of their stuff. I will have links in the show notes. As for myself, you can follow me on Blue Sky at stillloadingpodcast.com, on Instagram at stillloadingpod, on Twitch at stillloadingpod, where I stream whenever the hell I'm able to. It really just depends on what I'm feeling. I streamed for an entire week straight playing Metroid Prime, and now I haven't streamed in an entire week. So who knows what my schedule's going to be? It's all up in the air. But you can follow me at those locations. If you want to support the show, you can do so in a number of ways. You can give it a 5-star rating or review on whichever podcasting app you use. It does help more people find the show, and it makes me feel warm and fuzzy. I like feeling warm and fuzzy. You can also support the show over at Patreon, patreon.com/stillloadingpod for $1 a month. You get all the episodes a little bit earlier with better audio quality, as well as access to patron voting rights, which help guide the direction of the show, which the last poll, that it's already over, but there will be another one in another month or so. Bayou Billy won for the NES to talk about that Nintendo bump. It looks like we're going to be talking some adventures of Bayou Billy. And I'm so excited. It's
Mad World.
It's going to be a good time. I'm definitely going to be talking some Captain N with that too, because he was in Captain N for an episode or two. But yeah, so that's all.
I'm sorry to interrupt. When I hear something funny,
sure.
When Captain N aired here, none of my friends knew who Mega Man was. And only one of them knew who Simon Belmont was from Castlevania. Just had to put it out there. Oh, and nobody knew Kid Icarus, not even me. Sorry, there's also that thing.
So the major franchise.
Yeah. Basically, I think the only really popular Nintendo franchise was Contra, I think.
And that wasn't even in the cartoon.
And Mario, of course, yeah. And Mario, of course.
That's crazy.
Yeah. Sorry, go ahead. Sorry.
Yeah, part of the Nintendo bump is the only reason anyone even knows what Kid Icarus is, because that's
yeah. Well, and his name's Pit, but it's such a shitty character that we all call him Kid Icarus because of the Captain N cartoon. Yeah. Oh my god. Yeah, so that's all at the $1 tier. For $3 a month, you get everything I mentioned prior, plus patron shoutouts, which you heard at the beginning of this episode. For $4 a month, you get all that stuff plus 2 mini bonus episodes every single month. And for $5 a month, you get everything. All the previous tiers, the bonus episodes, the patron voting rates, the shoutouts, plus access to my monthly movie podcast, which right now is called Still Family, my monthly Fast and Furious movie podcast, where all the guests who join me aren't just friends, they're family. But that's it.
Family.
That is what, Chris?
Family.
Thank you. Thanks, Dom. But that's it. That's all the time I have for you on this episode of Still Loading. Thank you all once again for listening. Chris and st1ka, thank you once again for joining me.
Thank you.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah.
And with all that said, listeners, I will see you all next time.